Yo, what is good, everybody? So today is going to be really interesting, to say the least, probably a little spicy as well. And so, normally around this time of year, we're doing like the top 10, top 15 Call of Duty pros. The last video I made was a few months ago, and then we did the top 10 SMGs, the top 10 ARs, the top 10 flexes. And so I was lining it up so that we could do the top 15 CoD pros heading into CoD champs this week. And I actually made the thumbnail for that yesterday, but last night I was on YouTube just hanging out watching some videos, and then I see it right there. I see that Octane posted the top 10 Call of Duty pros heading into CoD champs, and I was like, dude, that is so tough. I was about to post that video tomorrow, and I was like, well, how about instead I just watch it, see what he's got going on, and then see what's up. So I ended up watching the video, and I was like, all right, I gotta react to this thing. So today we're reacting to Octane's top 10 CoD pros list and talking about some of the things in that video, and there's a lot to go through. So it's gonna be a blast. I'm really looking forward to it. So without further ado, after this long intro, let's finally get right into this one and talk about his list. Let's go. Alrighty, so I'm not actually gonna be showing his video in this video, but I highly recommend going and check that out for sure. He does a really good job of breaking it down, talking about his opinions and thoughts on a lot of the guys, and it's a fun watch. Obviously, he's a CoD pro. He plays against these guys on a regular basis, so of course he's gonna have an interesting insight into some of these guys and how they play and what it's like playing against them. And so he does a good job of kind of articulating that and talking through a lot of those guys on his list. But to be fair, I do have some interesting thoughts about his list and some things that maybe I disagree on overall, and so that's what we're talking about today. So my first thought overall was basically, I was a little bit surprised that he didn't set more of a foundation for how he's ranking them, or the thought process that he goes into how he ranks them. So, in all of my rankings videos, I talk about how the process in which I am grading these guys or ranking these guys, and generally that's on the question or the premise heading into the future event. And usually that question is, if I'm building a super team heading into that event, which guys would I want on my team? Obviously, there's some variables there as well with roles, and if you're building a team, with this chemistry of this player, work with that guy. But the idea, the process, like on paper, who would be the 5 most talented players or 4 most talented players I'd want on my team headed to an event. And that's kind of how I think about it heading into that. So he didn't really lay that foundation. And so I think it might cause for a little bit of confusion, maybe a little bit based off of how he's approaching this tier list specifically. And then generally I'm emphasizing like something along the lines of like, yeah, we're really taking this as like an individual basis and having to isolate the variables. And that's pretty tough to do. And he didn't really talk about any of that, about how tough it is to isolate the variables and isolate how good certain players are on the map versus how well they would perform on different teams or in different situations. And so it's a little bit interesting to see exactly how that could play out. It's overall a more maybe generic approach to ranking players, which is totally fine. But I think I'd prefer if he worked on like isolating it or talked about how hard it is to isolate some of these guys and then compare them a little bit more. So those are kind of my critiques going into it. And just ideally, I'd like to have some sort of baseline heading into these rankings so we can kind of know exactly what he's basing off of for all of these guys. But overall, his list, I guess I can just read through it and then we can talk about it a little bit. But his list was Scump at 10, Dashy at 9, Shotzzy at 8, Standy at 7, Kleenex at 6, Insight 5, Cellium 4, Cammy 3, and then Simp 2 and a BZ 1. So there's a lot of things that jump out to me immediately when seeing those rankings. The first thing that I want to talk about was that he actually didn't mention any honorable mentions, which I was really surprised about, because there's a handful of guys where I'm like, man, not even to mention these guys. I really think that these guys are worthy of mentioning at least. Hydra and Arcides are 2 guys who I think deserve to be in the top 10 list. I mean, obviously with Hydra, the second that he came into the league with his French accent and everything else, he's been frying and had an immediate impact on NYSL and became their lead. Slayer was fantastic in hardpoint especially. You could legitimately argue that he's the best hardpoint player on the year with how consistent he's been for New York. And then with the changing of rosters too, where he still looked really, really good in stage 5, even without Clay, on an individual basis, even though they weren't winning, because I mean, again, they have a new team and all those things we talked about in the tier list video last week as well. And then not to mention Hydra's S&D ability and the improvement that we saw throughout the year. At the beginning, he struggled a little bit, but then by heading into like stage 3, he was really, really good in S&D. And I think we're continuing to see a more aware and patient Hydra inside of Search and Destroy. And so he's a guy who I really think deserves to be inside the top 10. And I'm surprised he just didn't even mention him like really as like a guy who at least is right there on the fringe, because he is ridiculous. I mean, and then Arcides as well, with who's a guy who I think could definitely be right there on the list too. And then like Envoy, Skies are guys who are right there near that fringe top 10 that could be worthy of mentioning. Attach as well as a guy recently who's really improved his game, especially inside of respawns. And then S&D, there's an argument for him to being the best S&D player of stage 5, or at least top 3 or top 4. So the first thing that really stands out to me outside of the players that are missing would be the fact that Shotzzy's at 8. I mean, he gassed up Shotzzy a lot, and he had a lot of positives to say about Shotzzy, which is totally fair. I mean, obviously Shotzzy has a lot of reasons to be excited about. And, you know, he had Scump at 10, Dashy at 9, which I'm okay with. I mean, Scump, I definitely agree with what he said about Scump and him being a potential top 3 S&D player on the year. And that he also said that 6 through 10 are pretty interchangeable, and that he wouldn't really have any problem with somebody having like Dashy at 6 or, you know, Shotzzy at 6 or whatever it is, with those guys a little bit higher on the list, which I think is also fair as well. The only thing for Scump is where I would say maybe he's not 10, but maybe he's like 11 or 12, with, you know, inserting Hydra and what I would say Arcides maybe at 10 as well. So those guys are up on the list. And this is, I mean, again, I want to do my top 15 CoD Pros video this week as well. So maybe I just post that thing tomorrow and we can talk through some of the differences after that too. Those are 2 guys that I think might be above Scump at this point. But again, Scump is still an insanely valuable player, and top 12 is nothing to be ashamed about with how good Scump has been. So those would be my only other critiques there for the back half there. Dashy at 9, I could see an argument for him being higher, but I'm okay with Dashy at 9. Shotzzy at 8, again, like I said, is where I really am surprised about. So let's talk Shotzzy versus some of the other guys that are right up there right here in the next few. So again, he has Shotzzy at 8, then Standy at 7, Clean Insight, Cellium, Cammy through 7 through 3. So my instincts would say that Shotzzy deserves to be inside the top 5 for sure. It really comes down to the consistency on the year and the continual improvement that we've seen from Shotzzy. Sure, he had a bad stage 5 major, but besides that stage 5 major, he has been insane. So maybe if this is like a recency thing heading into champs coming off of a bad major, but you know, that's another situation where Octane didn't really specify like the ground rules for his ranking, whether or not this is specifically for champs or overall kind of like right now in the scene, because at least in my head, this would be a ranking for COD champs. And I would just be really surprised. I'd like to hear more from Octane about this actually, because I think he'd have a really interesting take specifically comparing these players. And that's one thing I wish he would have done more of in this video, was really comparing player to player. And generally that's an argument that at least I feel like the comments ask me to make on the regular basis, would be to like justify why Shotzzy should be below Standy or CleanX, or even like the ARs like Insight and Cellium, or Cammy, where, you know, in my head, I would be tempted to have Shotzzy at number 3 behind a BZ, Simp, and then Shotzzy. In stage 4 and stage 5, he was very, very good, but it just came down to the lack of performance at the major specifically. So I guess it's more of a projection that I assume Shotzzy's gonna bounce back here, and maybe Octane was hedging his bets a little bit about, you know, him versus Standy versus CleanX. And not to mention, he gave a lot of good reasons for why Shotzzy's going to bounce back and why he didn't perform as well at stage 5. Like he was talking about how SMGs can really struggle when their team's not winning those gunfights and creating the map control that they need to have to be able to slay out. And I mean, that's a real thing for sure. I definitely agree with that. And he also slid a little thick 6 inside of the Shotzzy talk, and I was a big fan of that, which was definitely quality for sure. If I'm building a super team, I'm still picking Shotzzy over Standy or CleanX, because I just have so much faith in the upside that Shotzzy has as a player. And then it comes down to a debate of consistency and what you're going to expect when you isolate Shotzzy on a team of 3 average COD pros, and kind of compare and contrast on an even playing field of Shotzzy versus Standy versus CleanX, and then even versus the ARs like Cellium, Insight, and Cammy. So that's why the debate's really, really difficult, and why I always say that we're talking about splitting hairs with some of the best pros in the CDL. But that, you know, that means like normally I tier list with 6 players inside the S tier. So that means that Octane doesn't think that Shotzzy would be an S tier player right now, which is interesting to me in a situation like that, unless he wants to group all of these guys inside the S tier, which is also interesting considering that at that point you'd have like almost 1/5 of the CDL inside the S tier. So I guess we'll have to see moving forward what that would look like for him. But I would, again, still think that Shotzzy should be higher up on the list with an argument above Standy and Kleenex. So the next few players on his list are also really, really interesting because, again, he has Standy at 7, Kleenex at 6, Inside at 5, Cellium 4, and Cammy 3. So, I mean, obviously, we're going to both agree on Simp and Abizi far and away being the best 2 players in the CDL. Well, I guess we can talk about maybe how you sort those, but we definitely agree that those 2 are in the tier of their own as the 2 best players in the CDL right now. And then it gets interesting where he thinks that Cammy would have an argument to potentially be inside that top 2. I'm not there with Cammy being inside the top 2 or 3. I really do think Cammy's an incredible player. Don't get me wrong. And in the last tier list video, I was definitely too low on Cammy. I had him at 9 in that video because I had him as the first player out of the S tier. And that was definitely not fair for me. I definitely regret putting him inside A, but I wanted to limit myself to having 8 players inside S tier, so that was a tough debate for me for like Arcides, Dashy, and Cammy. After seeing a lot of the comments and seeing a lot of the reasons from you guys in the comments, I can definitely understand having Cammy a little bit higher, but there's an interesting debate with Cammy versus Insight, and then really with Kleenex and Standy as well, and then really with Cellium too. So my initial instinct with that, I would just rather on an individual basis have Cellium over Cammy. And I think that Cellium's playstyle can definitely translate to success on basically any team in the CDL. And Cammy's can definitely be good as well, but I think I have a little bit more faith in Cellium translating to any team in the CDL. And again, this is the argument with isolating the variables. And in a situation where you had Cellium or Cammy with 3 league average teammates, who would perform better? And I still think that Cellium would perform better on a game-to-game basis and help that team more. And so that's kind of my debate when isolating those variables. And both of them, again, we're nitpicking things here where both of them are incredible, 2 of the most valuable players on the season, and Cammy's deservingly in the MVP conversation on the year. But there's also an interesting debate with who's a better player, Insight or Cammy. And I think a lot of COD pros would say that Insight's the better player right now, at least on the season 2. And I think I lean in that boat as well with Insight being the better player. I mean, I thought it was also really interesting that Octane said that he thinks that there's a solidified top 5 with Insight, Cellium, Cammy, Simp, and Abizi. I don't know if I necessarily agree with there being a solidified top 5, even though I did like his point about Cammy being like a true flex and that aspect of his game kind of being an X factor for why Cammy's higher on the list. So I could also see that argument as well. But on this season, and like with Insight in Cold War specifically, he also said that Insight he thinks is a locked and loaded top 5 S&D player, and I definitely agree with that as well. And so those are the small debates where you're like, okay, what's more valuable, being a flex and the playmaking ability, or Insight and the consistency and the positioning and kind of being that rock for the team to fall back on? And personally, I think Insight's just overall a little bit more valuable and a little bit better of a player for Toronto. But again, it's really, really close. And I mean, that's just why it's an interesting debate, and people get caught up in it and then they start hating because of these small differences. But it's like, you know, we're really nitpicking here when it comes to the best players in the league. And when you're dealing with 4 players, all who are on the same team since stage 2, like Toronto, there's not as many different variables and ways to compare and contrast than like what we'd like to see. And especially for guys who haven't been on very many teams in COD history, like a guy like Dashy, we've seen him dominate in a lot of different settings on a lot of different teams throughout a lot of different games. And so it's a little bit easier to believe in the individual talent of Dashy to transcend and be elite with even just 3 league average teammates. And that even dates back to World War II with a guy like Dashy, where he was literally insane on complexity. And I mean, I tell the story a lot, like on stream or whatever, when people ask about like my interactions with pros, but like, you know, I was reffing with MLG back in the day, and I was reffing that complexity team at some point throughout the year. Maybe it was early, maybe it was like New Orleans or something in World War II. And I was sitting right behind Dashy as I was reffing. And I'm like, dude, this kid's different, bro. He was sniping, and I swear he didn't miss a snipe for like the whole game and some S&D. He kind of caught my eye there. And ever since, I'm like, all right, I mean, he's the real deal. All that to say, those are kind of like the small, minute, like tiebreakers that generally make me want to put Dashy ahead of a guy like Cammy, just because of the long-term, those variables there. But again, we did see Cammy and CleanX. I'm arguing both sides here. We did see Cammy and CleanX look really, really good last year, and that's why they were on my some of my most underrated pro conversations last year on the podcast. And we talked about how those two guys were like real X factors heading into this year in the offseason. We talked about that a lot. And those are two guys who I was really high on after last year as well. And I had Cammy pretty high up in my rankings. And I got a lot of flack for having Cammy pretty high last year. And so the one thing I don't want to get kind of like marked as is a Cammy hater or a Cammy doubter, because that is definitely not the case. I'm a big fan of Cammy and think he's a fantastic player in the CDL, but I'm also a big fan of a lot of these other guys. And that's why it gets really tough. And then, like I said, there's also a really interesting debate with CleanX versus Standy. I would personally give the tiebreaker to Standy just because of the impact that he immediately had when he came in to the rocker. And again, these are two of the top 10 best players in the CDL. There's, like I said, we're splitting hairs with elite players like this and in completely different situations and different roles that they play for their teams. But Standy's impact was immediate and it was elite, and we saw that again this weekend with how good he is as a playmaker. And I felt bad not having Standy in my S tier as well, and there's just so many good players in the CDL. And so I think now I would put Standy ahead of like Arcides in a list, just after thinking about it a lot this week. After last week, I had to think about it a lot after some of the comments on that video, having when I had Standy ahead of Arcides. So all that to say, I think tomorrow's video with doing the top 15 pros and going through it in that way will be a lot of fun to kind of hash out some of those things too. And maybe I'm making a really long video and we just have a good conversation about it. But overall, I think Octane's list was really, really interesting. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was Simp versus aBeZy. And he had aBeZy above Simp. So he had aBeZy number 1, Simp number 2. And on the year, I've always said that I would have Simp over aBeZy in the slightest of edges. And again, oh my word, these guys are both incredible. You can't go wrong either way. And the argument for aBeZy is that his role is more difficult, that he does play more of the entry role. He does that first blood type role in S&D where he's generally flying in, finding a first kill, and getting that information for his team. The debate for aBeZy would be that he doesn't always win his first bloods, where a guy like Standy, he's done a much better job of actually on a consistent basis winning his first bloods. But then we have to look at untraded first bloods versus traded first bloods. And I mean, overall, aBeZy does do a pretty dang good job of trying to play his life after he gets a first blood. But my situation there is that Simp does a very, very good job of that. As when he does find those first bloods, he generally does a very, very good job of playing his life and staying alive. And like in a series like against New York, where that was really evident, where he's winning those first bloods against Asem inside mid and playing that lone wolf role that's really been highlighted this year as the guy who plays isolated on its own on one side of the map. And Simp has been doing an incredible job of that lately inside of Search and Destroy. But not only that, I really think that Simp's respawn game mode or gameplay is honestly at this point a little bit underrated. And this was something that Octane highlighted in his video, where he said that Simp does a really good job of playing his life and staying alive in hard points. And I'm surprised that he didn't highlight that more, because that really is the MVP aspect of Simp's game and what he brings to the table. And obviously people are quick to highlight the statistics and whatever it is, like the best KDs of stage 4 or stage 5 or whatever it is. Simp's ability inside hardpoint and control, especially where it's even more important to play your life, is elite, where he's able to find the 1 or 2 kills and then get away and maintain his life and maintain map control for his team, where aBeZy is generally more likely to throw away his life. And that also comes at the cost of streaks. And we talked about that a lot so far this year on the channel, and Simp's ability to find those streaks and change the game and give him a free break on a hardpoint hill or on control. And that value is so important to FaZe's success on the year, where that's why I personally give the slight advantage to Simp. And not only that, but if you're thinking like on a bigger term basis, Simp snipes and he hasn't been able to snipe this year. So that's another like ace up the sleeve that Simp has going for him in the future for future Call of Duties and in past Call of Duties. And overall, I think, again, it's really close. I have no problem with somebody saying aBeZy's a better player, again, because of that role argument, but I would give the 51-49% advantage to Simp because of the playmaking ability inside of respawns. And considering you're playing more respawns on the year than you're playing S&Ds, like generally you're playing almost 2 times the amount of respawns as you would play S&Ds. I think FaZe has played 40 respawns and 20 S&Ds since the start of stage 4. So overall, I mean, you have to prioritize the importance of person's play inside of respawns, and that's really where Simp has absolutely thrived this year. So those are just all of the different criticisms and interesting aspects. I would love to see Octane talk about some of those things and really compare and contrast some of these players on a more intricate basis, because the debate of Shotzzy and which player he would rather have on a team, like Shotzzy versus Standy versus Kleenex versus Hydra, all of those guys are insanely good. And that's why I would just say, I feel like I would still give the edge to a guy like Shotzzy in an argument like that when we're trying to talk on an individual 1-player basis and trying to isolate those variables at the end of the day. So it's interesting. I really like seeing the pros do these types of spicy content, and obviously the community enjoys it too, because his video has like 50,000 views in 24 hours. That is insane. I wish around here that we could ever hit those types of numbers. So congrats, Octane, on the success on YouTube as well. Things you love to see. It's always good seeing the pros making the content and bringing the audiences out here to YouTube. I always appreciate that as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did, like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you guys really enjoyed this. Like I always say, I'm trying to do this full time and I cannot do that without you guys. So again, I really appreciate all the support, all the comments, all of the kind comments especially. Always go a long way and really encourage me in the process. So I appreciate you guys. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you guys really enjoyed it. But as always, guys, I'm your boy SalvationsElite, and we will see you next time. I'm out.